Why would Barack Obama hand back the Nobel Peace Prize he received in 2009? Behind this stunning move lies a story of power, hypocrisy, and a prize many now call a tool of control. What did he discover that the world needs to know? The world was taken by surprise when news broke that former United States President Barack Obama had returned the Nobel Peace Prize he was awarded in 2009. The announcement spread rapidly, carried by major news networks, social media platforms, and official press statements, creating a wave of shock across continents. For many, the Nobel Peace Prize has long been regarded as the most prestigious recognition of efforts to promote peace and justice worldwide, and the idea that a former laureate would willingly surrender such an honor was almost unthinkable. Obama's decision did not come quietly or without consequence. It triggered debates in parliaments, emergency meetings in political circles, and countless discussions among analysts who struggled to understand the true magnitude of this act. When Obama first received the award in 2009, he was celebrated globally as a symbol of hope and new beginnings. The prize was presented at a time when his presidency was still fresh, and his rhetoric of unity and diplomacy resonated strongly with a world that longed for change after years of conflict. The Nobel Committee at the time described him as a figure who embodied promise, who had inspired millions with his vision of a more peaceful and cooperative global order. The medal and diploma handed to him in Oslo symbolized trust, not only in the man himself, but also in the values he seemed to represent. Fast forward more than a decade, and that same medal has now been sent back, casting doubt not just on the award itself, but on the integrity of the institution that bestowed it. The shock was not limited to the symbolism of a returned prize. It was amplified by who was returning it. Obama is not just any former leader. He remains one of the most recognized political figures of the 21st century, admired by millions and remembered as the first black president of the United States. His stature gave the act a weight that no other figure could have carried. If a man of his prominence and reputation chose to give back the Nobel, it suggested to the world that something deeper and troubling was at stake. This was not the rejection of an obscure honor by a little-known activist. This was the dismantling of a legacy moment by one of the award's most celebrated recipients. The timing of the announcement made it even more dramatic. It followed closely after the defiant refusal of the Nobel Peace Prize nomination by Ibrahim Traoré, the young president of Burkina Faso, who had denounced the award as hypocritical and unjust. Obama's action, coming so soon after Traoré's bold stand, gave the impression of a chain reaction. What was once considered unchallengeable, the value of the Nobel Prize, was now being openly questioned by leaders of vastly different backgrounds. The global community was left stunned, not only by the decision itself, but by the possibility that this could be the beginning of a larger re-evaluation of international awards and honors that had been taken for granted for over a century. The reaction in political capitals reflected the gravity of the moment. In Washington, reporters rushed to gather statements from officials and lawmakers who were caught off guard. In Oslo, the Nobel Committee faced urgent inquiries about the legitimacy of the prize and the implications of its return. Across Europe, debates erupted over whether this signaled a collapse in trust toward institutions long regarded as impartial guardians of peace. Meanwhile, in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, the act was greeted with applause and a sense of vindication, as many had long argued that Western institutions used symbolic honors to maintain influence rather than to genuinely recognize justice. The shock of Obama's return of the prize was not only political but cultural. Universities, think tanks, and civic organizations immediately began scheduling conferences to discuss the implications. Commentators in newspapers and television programs called it a watershed moment, an unprecedented gesture that would forever be remembered in the history of international relations. The Nobel Peace Prize, which had often been portrayed as untouchable, was suddenly open to scrutiny, its prestige shaken by the very person once held up as proof of its credibility. The sheer unexpectedness of the act made it one of the most talked about developments of the year, a turning point that left the world asking urgent questions about legitimacy, truth, and the future of moral authority in global affairs. Barack Obama did not return the Nobel Peace Prize without explanation. His decision was accompanied by words that cut directly to the heart of the matter. He explained that the prize, once admired as a symbol of peace, had been transformed into something far different. In his view, it was no longer a recognition of genuine efforts toward ending conflict or uplifting humanity. Instead, it had become a political instrument, a tool in the hands of powerful Western nations to cover their own failings and project an image of moral authority they did not truly possess. By returning the medal, Obama was making clear that he no longer wished to be associated with what he described as a symbol crafted to disguise injustice. When he first received the award in 2009, Obama admitted that he felt honored and humbled. At that time, many saw his rise to the presidency as historic, a moment that inspired hope around the world. Yet over the years, as wars dragged on and global inequalities deepened, criticism grew louder that his award had been premature and politically motivated. Those criticisms had followed him for more than a decade, but now, in his own words, he confirmed what many had long suspected. The Nobel Peace Prize, in his eyes, had been used not to promote peace, but to legitimize policies that harmed weaker nations. It was meant to polish the image of the West while silencing true voices that challenged injustice. Obama's statement carried a tone of regret, but also one of clarity. He admitted that at the time of receiving the award, he believed it to be the highest recognition of his efforts to build a more cooperative world. But with time, perspective, and the courage displayed by leaders like Ibrahim Traore, he realized the painful truth. He had been a participant in a system that awarded symbols to serve political agendas rather than to honor authentic struggles for peace. The medal, once cherished, had become a reminder of complicity, and returning it was the only way to separate himself from the hypocrisy he now saw clearly. This reasoning resonated widely because it reflected what critics of the Nobel Committee had been saying for years. The prize had increasingly been awarded not to activists working on the ground for peace, but to prominent political figures whose records were often mixed or controversial. Obama's acknowledgement that the award masked failures and injustices gave weight to these arguments and elevated them from speculation to undeniable fact. His words struck a chord because they came from someone who had once defended the legitimacy of the prize and benefited from its prestige. Now, by disavowing it, he confirmed the suspicion that it had become less about peace and more about politics. Observers noted that Obama's reasoning also connected with broader global frustrations about Western dominance in international institutions. Many saw his words as an admission that powerful nations often create narratives of peace and justice that serve their own interests. By calling the Nobel Prize a symbol of manipulation, Obama highlighted the imbalance between how the West presents itself and how it actually operates on the global stage. His return of the medal was therefore not just a personal act, but a public declaration against a system that uses symbolic awards to mask exploitation and control. The reasoning behind his action also revealed the personal weight it carried for him. To return such a prestigious award was not a small step. It required acknowledging that accepting it in the first place had been a mistake, one that tied his legacy to a structure he no longer believed in. His words showed that he wanted to take responsibility, not to erase the past, but to redefine his role in the present. By rejecting the Nobel Peace Prize, he was in effect rejecting the narrative it had created around him. He no longer wished to be remembered as a symbol of peace constructed by others, but as someone willing to confront uncomfortable truths, even at the cost of prestige. His reasoning exposed the Nobel Peace Prize as more than just a medal. It revealed it as part of a larger system of soft power, one that rewards compliance with Western ideals while sidelining or punishing those who resist. By returning it, Obama did not just criticize the institution, he stripped it of the legitimacy his name had once given it. The act turned the spotlight back on the Nobel Committee and its choices, forcing the world to question what the prize truly represents and whether it can still be seen as an impartial recognition of peace. Barack Obama's decision to return the Nobel Peace Prize cannot be separated from the influence of Ibrahim Traoré, the president of Burkina Faso. Just days before Obama's announcement, Traoré had refused the Nobel nomination, delivering a fiery rejection that shook the international community. He declared that he would never accept a title from nations that exploited the weak, fueled wars, and then pretended to stand for peace. His words struck with unusual force, not only because of their boldness, but because they came from a leader representing a nation often marginalized on the global stage. Traoré's defiance exposed a contradiction that many had felt for years, that Western-dominated institutions offered recognition as a way to maintain control rather than to genuinely reward justice. His act of resistance lit a spark, and Obama admitted that it made him reflect deeply on his own acceptance of the prize in 2009. In his statement, Obama acknowledged that Traoré's courage revealed to him a painful truth he had long tried to ignore. When he first stood in Oslo, medal in hand, he believed he was being honored for his ideals and leadership. But watching Traoré reject the award outright forced him to confront the possibility that his acceptance had not been an endorsement of peace, but rather a tool for powerful nations to claim moral legitimacy. He confessed that the young leader's defiance made him reconsider his own role in helping to sustain a narrative that masked deeper injustices. Traoré had shown what it meant to refuse complicity, and Obama recognized that returning the medal was the only way to align his actions with the truth he now understood. The influence of Traoré went beyond symbolism. It represented a generational and geographic shift. A young African leader from a small nation had challenged an institution revered by the West, and his words echoed globally. For a former American president, long celebrated as a statesman, to then follow that example carried immense weight. It was an acknowledgement that wisdom and courage did not only come from established powers, but also from those long silence in international affairs. Obama's decision to act after Traoré's rejection suggested that leadership could be inspired from unexpected places, and that even the most prominent figures could learn from voices outside the traditional centers of power. This connection between the two leaders gave Obama's act a deeper meaning. If he had returned the medal on his own, it would have been historic, but coupled with Traoré's refusal, it created a pattern. It suggested that the Nobel Peace Prize, once untouchable, was now under direct challenge from leaders both inside and outside the Western world. Traoré's words had exposed the hypocrisy, and Obama's action confirmed it. Together, their decisions transformed what could have been seen as isolated protests into a wider movement questioning the legitimacy of the award itself. The link between them also demonstrated the power of symbolic acts to inspire broader change. Traoré's refusal resonated most strongly in the global South, where people had long viewed international awards with skepticism. Obama's return of the medal amplified that sentiment, giving it recognition in the heart of the West. By acknowledging that Traoré's boldness influenced him, Obama bridged two worlds, the frustration of developing nations and the awakening of Western audiences. His admission showed humility, a willingness to learn from others, and the recognition that truth could come from places often dismissed by global elites. The significance of this connection was not lost on observers. Analysts pointed out that Obama's action would likely not have happened without Traoré's defiant stand. The young leader gave him both the inspiration and the moral justification to take a step that had seemed unthinkable for years. By admitting this influence openly, Obama reinforced Traoré's position as more than a national figure. He elevated him to the level of a global voice capable of reshaping narratives about peace, justice, and dignity. For millions around the world, the message was clear: if even a former US president could be moved to act by an African leader's refusal, then the monopoly of the West over defining honor and morality was beginning to crumble. The reaction from Western powers was immediate and intense. Barack Obama's return of the Nobel Peace Prize was not treated as a symbolic gesture alone, but as a direct challenge to the legitimacy of institutions long regarded as pillars of moral authority. Within hours of his announcement, members of the G7 convened emergency discussions, alarmed at the precedent this act could set. Leaders who had often used the Nobel Prize as a soft power tool understood the danger of one of their most celebrated figures undermining its credibility. French officials were among the first to express outrage, calling the decision irresponsible and demanding a formal explanation. In Berlin, government spokespersons defended the integrity of the Nobel Committee, warning that Obama's words could erode trust in international institutions that uphold peace and diplomacy. Across Western capitals, the tone was defensive, angry, and fearful of the ripple effects this act could trigger. In the United States, the response carried both political and emotional weight. Former President Donald Trump launched into fierce criticism, accusing Obama of betraying the nation and tarnishing its image on the world stage. On social media, he mocked the decision as childish and branded it a stunt designed to appeal to radicals. Trump's reaction reflected a broader frustration within sections of the American political establishment that viewed the Nobel Prize as not just a personal honor, but as an extension of Western prestige. Lawmakers in Washington went further, with some proposing inquiries into Obama's motivations and suggesting the possibility of restricting certain privileges normally extended to former presidents. For them, the act was not only symbolic resistance, but a threat that needed to be contained. The Nobel Committee itself was forced into crisis management mode. Officials released statements reaffirming the independence and value of the prize, insisting that it had never been used as a political weapon. Behind the scenes, however, there was evident concern. Media outlets reported that the committee feared a loss of credibility, especially as the event coincided with Ibrahim Traore's high-profile rejection of the nomination. The combination of defiance from an African head of state and the return of a prize by a former U.S. president created an unprecedented challenge to their reputation. Efforts were made to coordinate with allied governments to push back against the narrative that the Nobel Prize had been compromised by political interests. The Western media environment quickly became saturated with commentary designed to frame Obama's decision as misguided. Prominent newspapers and broadcasters in the United States, France, and Germany portrayed his return of the medal as a lapse in judgment, an act that undermined international stability. At the same time, think tanks and analysts aligned with Western governments warned of the dangerous precedent this could set, arguing that if symbolic honors like the Nobel could be openly rejected, it would weaken the moral foundation of international cooperation. Articles and broadcasts highlighted Obama's decision as divisive, painting it as a betrayal of unity at a time when the world faced rising global tensions. Western leaders also framed the act as an attack on shared values. At international forums, officials emphasized the importance of defending institutions that represent peace and dialogue. The German chancellor warned that turning the Nobel Prize into a political statement was an abuse of tradition, while the French president described the return of the award as a failure to respect the responsibility of global leadership. These statements revealed deep unease, not only about the loss of prestige, but about the risk that others might follow the same path. By defending the prize so forcefully, Western leaders attempted to reassert control over the narrative and prevent the act from inspiring further dissent. The anger and defensiveness exposed the vulnerability of the West's reliance on symbolic power. For decades, awards like the Nobel Peace Prize had been used to project authority and moral superiority, reinforcing the image of Western nations as champions of peace. Obama's rejection of that narrative tore a hole in this carefully built image. The furious response showed how much was at stake. Western leaders understood that the loss of credibility for the Nobel Prize was not just about one award. It risked unraveling a system of influence that allowed them to define the language of peace and justice on the global stage. This fear of losing control shaped the intensity of their reaction, ensuring that the fallout from Obama's decision would not be forgotten quickly. The reaction outside of the Western world contrasted sharply with the outrage seen in G7 capitals. Across Africa, Latin America, and Asia, Barack Obama's return of the Nobel Peace Prize was welcomed as an act of courage and humility. Many saw it as a long overdue acknowledgement of what leaders and activists in the global South had been saying for decades, that Western-dominated institutions often use symbolic awards not to reward genuine peace efforts, but to control narratives and silence dissent. For ordinary citizens, intellectuals, and grassroots movements, Obama's action was interpreted as a form of atonement, a public admission that even the most celebrated Western leaders had been complicit in sustaining a system built on hypocrisy. His decision resonated deeply with people who had lived through the consequences of wars, interventions, and economic exploitation justified under the banner of peace. In Burkina Faso and neighboring countries, crowds gathered in rallies holding banners that celebrated both Ibrahim Traore's refusal and Obama's return of the medal. The two leaders were praised together as figures who had exposed the truth behind the Nobel Prize. In many African capitals, commentators on television and radio hailed the moment as historic, claiming it proved that the global South no longer needed validation from Western awards to define its worth. The act was seen not as weakness, but as strength, a reclaiming of dignity in the face of centuries of dominance. Universities in West Africa organized discussions on the symbolic importance of rejecting titles imposed from abroad, with students and professors debating how such acts could inspire a broader struggle for sovereignty and self-determination. In Latin America, the symbolism struck a familiar chord. Activists in countries like Bolivia, Venezuela, and Brazil pointed to Obama's decision as evidence that the world was beginning to recognize the manipulative nature of institutions created and controlled by the West. Writers and journalists framed it as part of a larger awakening, a moment when truth could no longer be hidden behind carefully crafted images of morality. Community organizations used the event to fuel campaigns demanding a rethinking of how international recognition is distributed, urging that awards should come from voices rooted in justice and solidarity rather than from committees with political ties. The return of the prize provided validation to movements that had long resisted foreign interference in their domestic politics. Asia also responded with a wave of commentary. In countries such as India, Pakistan, and Indonesia, scholars and politicians noted how Obama's decision reinforced their criticisms of Western double standards. For years, many had argued that peace prizes were selectively given to support Western allies or to polish the reputations of leaders who served strategic interests. Now, with Obama himself declaring that the medal symbolized manipulation, their arguments gained undeniable weight. Activists in Southeast Asia highlighted the moment as proof that symbolic resistance could challenge even the strongest institutions. The idea that rejecting or returning an award could spark global debate inspired conversations on how people across the region might also confront systems of control hidden behind symbolic honors. For the global South, the act was not betrayal but liberation. Obama's return of the medal was seen as breaking chains, refusing to allow a prestigious title to serve as justification for policies that harmed weaker nations. The narrative shifted from one of prestige to one of resistance, and in that shift, people found hope. Social media across Africa and Latin America was flooded with messages of support, memes celebrating Obama's decision, and hashtags declaring that true peace could never be awarded by those who profited from war. Intellectuals framed the act as a step toward building new systems of recognition rooted in fairness and equality rather than in the politics of domination. The broader significance lay in how the global South interpreted the decision as part of a wider awakening. Obama's act validated the suspicions of millions who had long doubted the legitimacy of Western institutions. It sparked conversations not only about the Nobel Prize, but about the broader structures of international recognition, aid, and diplomacy. By siding with the truth exposed by Traore, Obama gave weight to voices that had often been dismissed as radical or extreme. His decision encouraged many to believe that the tide was beginning to turn, that symbolic power was no longer unshakable, and that a new chapter in global justice was beginning to take shape.